Okay, well, welcome back to week number two. We'll go ahead and get started. It is after 4 o'clock, so for those of you who are here, I don't want to make you wait. And I know we're about maybe half the class here so far, so we'll start slowly, and hopefully they'll join in and be able to catch up with what we are doing. But again, welcome back to this week. Thank you for your introductory postings. I appreciate those. I went through and read all the introductions. I'm always struck by the backgrounds and the undergraduate degrees that everyone brings into the program with them. And I saw we did a student survey, and I think I mentioned maybe last week, but in the student survey, I was expecting a lot of political science and public administration undergraduate degrees, and I saw a lot of communication and sociology and other types of degrees, which is really good because it gives us nice variety in terms of background experiences. And I think that's true for this class as well. I believe we have political science, but we also had public health and urban planning and sociology, and so a good variety, even though we are a very small group in the class this semester. But thank you for those introductory postings. Again, they're not graded. It was just a way in which I can start to get to know you, and you can start to get to know others in the class as well. Your first graded beach board essay will be due then next Monday on February 7th, and that's due by midnight on February 7th, 11:59 p.m., however you want to call it, but by the end of Monday, February 7th. For that beach board essay, again, that is graded, what you'll be doing is you'll be, based upon your reading of Federalist number 10 and what Madison has to tell us in Federalist number 10 about factions and democracy. After reading Madison's work in number 10, what you'll do is you'll tell me if you think that today's society, today's country is more factionalized than it was back in Madison's time. And if you do believe it is more factionalized, I believe it, most people will, because it probably is, then what would you do about those factions, and how could you better balance factions against each other? When you read number 10, which I assume most of you have already read going into tonight, Madison makes a compelling argument that factions are intertwined within our system of democracy. And there are two ways that you can combat factions. You can either eliminate them, but if you eliminate factions, you're basically eliminating democracy. Because in democracy, we believe in free speech, we believe in freedom of assembly, we believe in people's ability to share their opinions with others in society. It's what Theodore Loy refers to as the marketplace of ideas. So in order to get rid of factions, you would have to get rid of the marketplace. And by getting rid of the marketplace, you're getting rid of your core principles of democracy. So Madison says that's not possible. So instead of getting rid of factions, what we try and do is we try and control their effects. And that's the second way he says we can deal with factions. You control their effects by balancing one faction against another. So you have a pro gun control group, and you have an anti-gun control group, and those two factions then balance each other in the ways in which they lobby Congress on gun control legislation. So the presence of all these interest groups that we have today is one way in which we can control the effects of factions by balancing one group against another. And that's what a faction is. When Madison was conceptualizing this idea of factions, he was talking about groups that have certain interests and groups that are trying to achieve certain types of things. And so when you have these groups that are trying to achieve things and have certain interests that are opposed to each other, that's when you end up having conflict between these groups. And that conflict is elemental to a democracy. So we just try and control their effects. It's what Hamilton referred to in Federalist number 28, which you're not reading for this class, but in Federalist 28, as balancing ambition against ambition. And that's basically what we were trying to do in terms of controlling the effects of these factions. So for beach board number 1, based upon your reading of Federalist 10, you will talk about if you believe that we are more factionalized than we were back in Madison's time, and then offer some recommendations for how we can better balance these factions against each other and control the negative effects of factions. Now, do remember by midnight on February 7th, what you're going to be turning in is you're going to have your initial response to that prompt that I provided for you in the discussion board form. and then you'll have responses to 2 classmates' posts. So as I said last week, it really is in all of our best interest if you can get your initial post done earlier in the week rather than waiting until next Monday. That will then give people something to respond to so that we're not all in the discussion board next Monday scrambling around trying to make our initial and our response posts. So it really is beneficial if you can do that initial post a little bit earlier in the week, and then you can do your response post perhaps over the weekend. And I think that usually works out pretty well. So that's your discussion board, your beach board essay post that's due next Monday on February 7th. Any questions on that assignment? Okay. It's pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out via email and I'd be happy to answer any of those questions. Now, this week, what we are planning on doing tonight is we are going to turn our attention to our substantive information for this class. And this week is our week where we provide the foundations of American government and kind of a refresher for those of you who've had undergraduate American government. Yeah, I know a lot of folks, if you're not a political science major, you may have had one class in American government at the undergraduate level. Perhaps that class was quite a while ago. So it's important here this week that we create the common framework for us all to understand the foundations of American government, American institutions, American political culture, where those institutions and where that culture came from, because what we do in public administration as public servants is obviously rooted squarely within that American government culture and those American government institutions. And so this is really what sets this version of 500 apart from the way in which you used to do 500 in the past. So that's our whole purpose site. So in the first half of class, I've got some slides we'll go through to, again, create that common understanding of American government, what it is and where it came from and how it affects public administration. Then we'll take a break. And then after the break, when we come back, we will delve into the U.S. Constitution. And I'll take you through the Constitution. Hopefully you've had a chance to look over the Constitution before tonight's class, but it's very rare that we have time to actually sit down in the course of our jobs and our lives and actually read the Constitution. And so I think it's important we go through and really highlight the major elements of the Constitution that have direct implications for what we do as public administrators. And so we will do that then in the second half of class tonight, again, kind of hitting the highlights as they pertain to public administration. So that's the plan of attack for tonight. So let's get started with our discussion of American government and the foundations of American government. And again, I'm assuming that this is all going to be familiar to you, even if you haven't had it for a few years, but we're all familiar with the principles and the concepts we're going to be talking about in the next few slides. But we know our system of American government is predicated upon this idea of social contract theory. And we'll talk more in depth about social contract theory in a minute, but it's based upon the theory that power comes from the people and that people decide to give up and relinquish some power to government, and government will then in exchange use those powers judiciously to provide for societal welfare, to provide for society and to help society function. So the social contract that you have between individual citizens and their government, that contract is predicated upon limiting the powers of government. So government does not have inherent power. The powers that government has, those powers will come from the people and the powers that the people decide to give to government. I mean, that's a basic principle that comes out of John Locke and his second treatise on government back in the 1600s. And John Locke, his second treatise on government and the social contract theory, really formed the basis for a lot of the framers' understanding of what this new government should look like in the late 1700s. Jefferson believed so much in a lot of the writing of John Locke that he literally took the words right out of John Locke's writing. And he actually borrowed the words. Today we might say he may have plagiarized a little, but he took the words directly from John Locke and just made small modifications to them. So, John Locke talked about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And Thomas Jefferson took those words and made them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so very much John Locke and his social contract theory had a major impact upon the thinking of the framers and the way in which they conceptualize our government. So our government is based upon limited power for government. So the power comes from the people. We need to limit the power of government. How we limit the power of government is we limit the power of government, as you know, horizontally as well as vertically. We limit the power of government horizontally through separation of powers. So the creation of an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch. Again, going back to Federalist 28, this is yet another example of balancing ambition against ambition. So we separate the powers between these three different branches of government. And although the framers believed in having this type of separation of powers, Hamilton was very much a believer in a strong executive, and he really wanted to put a lot of the power in that executive branch in that presidential position. You had other framers who believed that Congress, the legislature, should be the first branch of government. So not everyone agreed upon exactly how to separate the powers, but the majority of framers believed that those powers needed to be separated across different branches. So that's our first way in which we limit power, is horizontally with separation of powers. Then, as you all know, the second way we do it is vertically through our system of federalism. Now, according to the Constitution, the only governments that are mentioned in the Constitution are the national and state governments. Local governments are not mentioned in the national Constitution. So local governments do not have constitutional standing. The only protection that local governments have against federal and state governments will be those protections that are provided within usually state constitutions. There's a rule that was promulgated by an Iowa judge back in the 1900s by the name of John Dillon. And Judge Dillon promulgated what was come to be known as Dillon's Rule. And Dillon's Rule says that local governments are creatures of the state. And as creatures of the state, they are created by the state, they are empowered by the state, and they can then, if necessary, be destroyed by the state. And that's what's known as Dillon's Rule. So we're talking about constitutional federalism and the separation of power between different levels of government in this vertical arrangement. We are only talking about the national government and state governments. Once we start talking about the protections that local governments get out of state constitutions, and we start talking about 3 levels as opposed to 2, we have then transitioned from this idea of constitutional federalism to the idea known as intergovernmental relations. And the elective course that we teach in this program is called Intergovernmental Relations, PPA 535. And it's called Intergovernmental Relations because we focus on all 3 levels of government, federal, state, and local. Back when I was in my doctoral program, the course I took was called Federalism. And even though we did talk to a degree about local governments, the course really focused on constitutional federalism and the national and state levels. Here in this program, we include all 3 in this concept known as intergovernmental relations. So a basic understanding of American government is an understanding of how we limit the power of government horizontally through separation of powers, and then vertically through our system of federalism, and then later intergovernmental relations. So it's a government of limited power. Our form of government is also what we refer to as a democratic republic. So we are a combination of both a democracy as well as a republican form of government. So let me ask you, what makes us a democracy? We call ourselves a democracy. What makes us a democracy? Again, you can either use text chat or the microphone, whatever you're comfortable with.
The thing that makes us a democracy is the fact that we're able to have elections. So the majority is able to elect or have an option to pick whoever they want in office.
Right. Yeah, in a democracy, the people decide. In a democracy, the power flows from the people, and the people can actually participate in their own governance. They can participate in their own decision-making process. It's interesting the variation that we see across different states in the US in terms of the amount of participation that's allowed for individual citizens. If you look at a state like here in California, we have provisions here in California known as initiatives and referenda that allow us as individual citizens to participate in the decision making. So if you want to amend the Constitution, you believe there should be a change made to the Constitution, what you as an individual citizen can do is you can collect signatures. And if you get enough people to sign your petition, then you can force an issue on the ballot at the upcoming election, and then people can vote directly on that issue. That's how we have amended the Constitution here in California very frequently. It's what's called the initiative process. Just recently, we saw this recall effort against Governor Newsom. And that recall effort all came from the initiative process. People got together and they put together a petition with enough signatures that they could then force the issue of recalling the governor onto the ballot. We've got a movement here in LA County with the district attorney here in LA County to again do a recall of Gascon. This is the second attempt to do it. They're collecting signatures to qualify for the ballot. So that initiative process, like we have here in California, really does speak to democracy, and that it allows people to make their own decisions and participate directly in their own governance. Then there's also what's called the referendum process. And we also have that here in California, and most other states have a referendum process as well. In a referendum process, the state legislature can decide, well, we're not going to make a decision about this issue ourselves. We are going to put this issue on the ballot and let the voters decide. So the big difference is with a referendum, the state legislature puts it on the ballot to allow the voters to decide. With an initiative, the voters themselves force the issue on the ballot by collecting petitions on signatures on a petition. So here in California, we have both initiative as well as referenda. In other states, they'll only have referenda. So the more avenues, if you will, that a state provides to its citizens to participate in their own governance, the more you have what we consider to be a direct democracy. And so we have a lot of those elements of a direct democracy. That's the democratic part of a democratic republic. The republic part comes from having people make decisions for us. And so we elect representatives to make decisions for us. When you elect someone to make a decision for you, that's a Republican form of government. And again, where you're using Democratic and Republican, the small d's instead of capital letters. So in a Republican form of government, you elect your representatives. And so we elect people to the office of the presidency, we elect people to House of Representatives and to the US Senate, to the California Assembly, to the California Senate, to our city councils, as mayors, as members of local school boards, regional water districts, on and on and on. So we elect those people and we entrust them to then go and make those decisions for us. So we are both a democracy as well as a Republican form of government. But again, the amount of democracy, direct democracy that is out there really does depend upon the state and individual state constitutions. So we are a democratic republic. As a democratic republic, as we said before, our entire system of government is predicated upon this John Locke idea of a social contract theory. People give up power to government, and then they enter into a contract with the government for how the government will use those powers. That agreement, that contract between the people and their government, that's what's usually known as a constitution. So you also hear people refer to us as a constitutional government. We are indeed a constitutional government because that constitution is our social contract. When you look at some of the British political philosophers in the 1600s, in 15 and 1600s, two of them really stand out. One that stands out is, again, John Locke and his social contract theory and this idea of written in his second treatise on government. The other philosopher who really stands out is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes and his work called Leviathan. And they really stand in stark opposition to each other. Thomas Hobbes, in his Leviathan, described a state of nature that if people are just left to their own devices without a government, that state of nature would be brutish, and it would be very violent, and it would be very short, in that people would just be warring with each other, trying to get everyone else's possessions. That there needs to be something to control the actions of people, and that something for Thomas Hobbes was this government. And so government, this Leviathan, would have the power, and then would use that power to basically keep people in check, to make sure that it wasn't just a violent state of nature, and that there was actually some rules in society. And that was Thomas Hobbes. Then you had John Locke come along later, and John Locke postulated this social contract theory, that it really wasn't government that was the repository of power. It was really the people who were the repositories of power. And then the people decide what powers to give up to government in this contract that they are forming with the government, this constitution. And fortunately for us, the framers really bought into John Locke and social contract theory, as opposed to Thomas Hobbes and his theory of Leviathan. And so that's why we end up being a constitutional type of government. Thomas Jefferson, as I said, was a big believer in John Locke, and took a lot of the work of John Locke and used it directly in our formulation of our government in the late 1700s. Jefferson also was a big believer in Rousseau, another political philosopher. And he believed what Rousseau said is that what happens if the government then violates the contract that it has with the people? And Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson would argue that if that ever happens, it's up to the people to overthrow the government. And they were big believers in rebellion. And every now and then, people may need to stand up and rebel against their government if their government was violating this social contract. So the social contract, the Constitution, this written agreement, is extremely important to the founders. And so that's why they spent a lot of time working on the Constitution to try and get the Constitution, quote unquote, right. And we'll talk about two different constitutions that we've had in our history: the Articles of Confederation and our current day Constitution. Now, you know, after our struggle for freedom from Britain, we needed to have a constitution. So the first constitution we devised, known as the Articles of Confederation. And I provided the Articles of Confederation on our Beach Board site for you to take a look at. You didn't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it is important to understand the Articles of Confederation, this first constitution, and some of the inherent flaws in that first constitution that then gave rise to our current constitution that we got in the Constitutional Convention. So the framers put together this first constitution called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were truly a confederation. And when we talk about a confederation, we are talking about sovereign entities coming together in an alliance to serve their own interests. And so you're not talking necessarily about, the national government being powerful or being all powerful. You're talking about each state retaining its own sovereignty. And each sovereign state in a confederation agrees to work with each other for the common good of all of those states. A confederation is much looser than what we currently have under our Constitution. But under the Articles of Confederation, that's what was created: a confederation, an alliance of these sovereign states. And you can see that very clearly as you read through the Articles of Confederation. One point that supports that is when you look at the title of the Articles of Confederation. They say in the Articles of Confederation, we are going to give a name to this new alliance, this new confederation. And the language they use is say the style. And when they say the style, they mean the name. But the style of this alliance will be the United States of America, capitalized, capital U, capital S, capital A, United States of America. That use of the term as a proper noun, United States of America, really only happens in that section of the Articles of Confederation when they're naming it. They're saying, this is our name, we're going to make it a proper noun, this is our name, this is what we are. But in all other references to the United States throughout the Articles of Confederation, the United States is usually referred to as the United States in Congress assembled. And that's how they refer to it, the United States in Congress assembled. That's a very important point, because when the framers said United States in Congress assembled, they're basically saying that we are the United States proper noun when the states get together in this meeting known as a Congress. You know, a Congress is another word for a meeting. So tonight we're having a Congress of the PPA 500 class. A Congress is a meeting. So they're basically saying it's the United States when the states get together in this meeting together, that's when we're considered to be the United States. So it's a very important point that it wasn't a permanent type of institution, but rather it was just a temporary meeting. So the states would get together in this Congress, they would meet, and then when the meeting was over, they'd all go back to their home states, and they would then govern in their home states individually. The other important point with this Congress of the States, the meeting of the states, is that states could recall their delegates at any time that they so desired. So if the Virginia delegation doesn't like what's going on in this Congress, in this meeting of the states, they could simply pull their delegates back to Virginia and say, we're just going to pick up our marbles and we're going to go home and we're no longer going to play in this confederation, this alliance. So all the power, that decision-making power under the Articles, really did reside with individual states. Another important point with the Articles of Confederation is it really didn't have what we would consider to be a president. I mean, the president came from Congress, was a member of Congress. So you didn't have an independent president. You didn't have an independent judiciary. You essentially had these ad hoc meetings of the states, and that was your national government. That was your legislature, these informal meetings of the states in this Congress. So the problem, obviously, with that is when the states all retain their own authority and you don't have a strong, vigorous national government, then you don't really have anyone to enforce things like uniform currencies. And so even though the states, when they were in this Congress, had the ability to coin money, there's very little practical power to enforce that. And so you still had states using different currencies in their trade with each other. Well, you can imagine how difficult it is to carry out trade when you have one state using one form of currency and another state using another form of currency. You also didn't have any type of standing army. You had the state militias. And so the protection would come from these individual state militias. So if we were invaded, you would have to call up the Virginia State Militia, or the Maryland State Militia, or the New York State Militia. And that's where our defense and our protection came from. That ended up being a major problem. And for all of those of you who remember your history classes, we had this situation that was known as Shays' Rebellion that occurred in between the Articles of Confederation and the creation of our new Constitution. Shays' Rebellion, if you remember from your American history classes, there was a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays. And he led a rebellion of farmers. And what was going on is farmers were having trouble paying their debts. And they were having their farms foreclosed upon. And they were losing their family farms and they were going bankrupt. And so these farmers rebelled to try and mitigate the situation, try and find a way to keep their family farms. It took a lot of effort and a lot of time for the state militia to put down this insurrection of ill-equipped farmers and a retired Army captain. Because it was so difficult to put down this insurrection, it really raised a lot of alarm bells for a lot of the framers who said, if we can't put down this insurrection of farmers and a retired Army captain, what are we going to do if France comes knocking at our door? Or if England comes back, or one of these other foreign powers invades us? We basically have no adequate protection. So we need a stronger national defense than what the Articles of Confederation were giving us. So that was one of the triggering events. And as you go through this MPA program, you'll end up taking a course in policy analysis, and you'll talk about how policy is formulated. How policy is formulated, usually there's a triggering event. There's some type of an occurrence that happens that galvanizes the opinions of the public and galvanizes decision-maker opinion that a change really needs to be made in policy. It's what the policymakers refer to as punctuated equilibrium, and that we usually keep the same policies in place until there's some triggering event that then forces us to make a change. This idea of punctuated equilibrium. Well, this was your triggering event, or one of your triggering events, that then led a lot of people to say, we need to amend the articles. We need to change the articles to give us a stronger national defense. So that ended up giving us the Constitutional Convention. At the Constitutional Convention, you had a situation where everyone did not arrive at the same time. You know, back then the roads were not good, and it took some folks a lot longer to get to the convention than their colleagues. Those who arrived at the Constitutional Convention first were people like James Madison and his supporters. James Madison led a faction at the Constitutional Convention known as the Federalists, and the Federalists arrived there first. The Federalists believed that we needed to get rid of the articles and replace them with a new constitution that would create a much more independent and a much stronger national government. They kind of got the ball rolling toward this whole idea of replacing the articles with a brand new constitution. The other faction that wanted to keep the articles and just merely amend them came to be known as the Anti-Federalists, led by Sherman and others. The Anti-Federalists, the majority of those folks, did not get to the convention as early as the Federalists. So by the time the Anti-Federalists got to the convention, the ball had already started rolling toward replacing the articles with a brand new constitution, as opposed to just merely amending those articles. But at the Constitutional Convention, you basically had three main issues that the framers had to contend with, three main conflicts that were going on. The first conflict that they had to deal with was the conflict between large states and small states. States with large populations versus states with smaller populations. States with smaller populations were concerned that they would be overwhelmed by the larger states. Because if you did representation in Congress based upon proportional representation, that means that the larger states would have much more representation than the smaller states. The smaller states were also concerned that they would have to pay an equal amount to the larger states in paying off the debts from the Revolutionary War. And they didn't feel that was fair. They thought that debt should be apportioned according to the size of the state. So when they were creating the Congress, this idea of a standing Congress, a real Congress that was permanent, they had to come up with an idea about how states would be represented in this Congress. So you had two contending plans. The first plan was known as the Virginia Plan, and the Virginia Plan was the large state plan. And the Virginia Plan called for a one-house Congress that was based upon proportional representation. So the larger states would have more representatives than smaller states. Smaller states floated what was called the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan called for equal representation. So again, a one-house Congress with equal representation. Every state has the same number of representatives. The compromise that the framers came to, they sometimes known as a Great Compromise, but it's the Connecticut Compromise. And in the Connecticut Compromise, you had a compromise where the framers decided, well, what we'll do is create a two-house Congress, where we create a House of Representatives based upon proportional representation and a Senate based upon equal representation. So you get a little bit of the Virginia Plan, you get a little bit of the New Jersey Plan in this Connecticut Compromise. That is kind of a microcosm of a lot of the decision making that went on at the Constitutional Convention. It was all about finding compromise between these different factions. So this is the compromise we found between the large state and the small state factions. So that's how the first major issue was dealt with. A two-house Congress, one house proportional representation, one house equal representation. Then the second major conflict that they had to deal with was the issue of slavery. So you had some states where their entire economy was based upon the institution of slavery, other states where their economy was not based upon slavery. So you basically had slave states and non-slave states. Question then became, how could they come to a compromise on the issue of slavery? Whereas in terms of the conflict between large and small states, I think you can argue the framers came up with a workable and a logical type of resolution. They failed to do so on the issue of slavery and the differences between slave and non-slave states. The two compromises they came to that, again, would sow the seeds for the Civil War. First, the 3/5 compromise. In the 3/5 compromise, they had to decide on representation. So how much representation would someone in servitude count in comparison to a free person? And so a person in servitude would count for representation purposes as 3/5 of a person. Obviously, an important way to deal with it in today's society. That's how the framers dealt with that in their compromise in the battle between slave and non-slave states. Then the other compromise that they came to was a compromise over the slave trade. So there were some framers who wanted to end the slave trade immediately in the Constitutional Convention and put a provision in the Constitution to abolish the slave trade altogether. Representatives from slave states obviously did not want to do that. So the compromise they came to was to put a clause in the Constitution that barred the elimination of the slave trade until at least 1808. So they basically took the issue and they punted it a few years into the future. So there is a provision in the Constitution where there can be no law to eliminate the slave trade until at least the year 1808. So that's how the framers dealt with the issue of slavery. Again, extremely poorly, but that's the way in which they dealt with the issue. One person you can credit to a degree in the Constitutional Convention is James Madison. Even though James Madison was a slaveholder, he came from a large plantation that he inherited from his father. I believe that the plantation had upwards of 100 slaves working on it. Madison, over his lifetime, only freed one of those individuals, so he doesn't get a whole lot of credit for that, obviously. But Madison, one thing he did do that was a positive in relation to slavery is that he fought very hard to stop the codification of slavery within the Constitution. A lot of the slave state representatives, and remember, Virginia was a slave state. A lot of the slave state representatives wanted to put clauses in the Constitution about slave ownership and penalties for people stealing slaves and slaves as property. They really wanted that codified within the Constitution. Madison was able to stop that and keep that codification out of the Constitution. I think if that went into the Constitution, was codified in the Constitution, I think it would have been even worse than it was, the culmination in the Civil War in 1861. So that is one thing he gets credit for, but certainly we can't give him too much credit because he was a slave owner and slave owner from a very large plantation. But this slave, non-slave state type of conflict was something that the framers had to deal with, and unfortunately they dealt with it with the compromises that they did. Then the third conflict that we had is the one that I had mentioned earlier, and that's the conflict between the Federalist faction and the Anti-Federalist faction. The Federalist faction, led by people like James Madison, really believed in getting rid of the Articles and replacing the Articles with this brand new Constitution that would create a new, stronger national government, independent national government. The Anti-Federalists, led by people like Sherman, they wanted to retain states' rights. They really felt that all we needed to do was amend the Articles in order to make the Articles stronger on non-defense. So we needed to have some language in there that would give us a stronger defense rather than just relying upon all these individual state militias. Madison's job, and the Federalist job, was when the Anti-Federalists arrived, is they had to get the Anti-Federalists to admit that they wanted more out of this Constitution than just stronger national defense. And the tool that they used to do that was to really play on economic considerations. Now, when you think about the delegates who were at the Constitutional Convention, in order to be a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, you had to be white, you had to be a male, you had to own property. And if you were not a white male property owner, you were not going to be a representative at the Constitutional Convention. So these white male property owners were what we consider to be the creditors at that time. They were the ones who had given their resources and loaned their money to help support the Revolutionary War and to help fund these state militias in the Revolutionary War and the Continental Army. As creditors, they wanted to get their money back. They didn't want this money to just go away. They wanted to get repaid their debts. The Federalists knew that. And so the Federalists really played on that economic consideration to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that, yes, we want to get our debts repaid, and so there needs to be some role for the national government in terms of economic regulation. So the national government needs to go beyond just defense. It needs to be involved in economies and the regulation of the economy so that we can get our revolutionary debts repaid to us. There's a very famous historian by the name of Charles Beard. And Charles Beard, long time ago in the early 1900s, wrote a very controversial thesis known as the economic interpretation of the Constitution. And Beard, in his economic interpretation of the Constitution, argued that the framers were there at the Constitutional Convention acting on their own economic self-interest. And so they were there to try and promote their own economic self-interest rather than necessarily, the interests of society as a whole. That type of thesis got some very poor treatment from other historians, and there's a big blowback from the discipline of history saying that's not true, that they were there for more, for higher types of motivations, that they were there more to create a new government, a new society, and they weren't just there for their own rational self-interest. Where the field of history has kind of come down in the years since Beard's thesis is that, yes, the framers were there for economic self-interest, but they were there more for their state's economic self-interest as opposed to their own personal economic self-interest. But there was a very big economic component to a lot of the decision-making that went on at the Constitutional Convention. And once Madison was able to expose that, he got the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of the national government than just national defense. And once they admitted that, it was essentially game over. There was no rescuing the Articles of Confederation. We needed a new constitution because the changes we were making were so whole-scale that it wouldn't make sense to try and just amend the Articles. We needed to have a brand new constitution. And that's where our current constitution came from. So this constitution that we get out of the Constitutional Convention is this social contract, for better or worse, between people and their government. The Constitution is a series of compromises. And after our break tonight, when we talk about the Constitution, we'll highlight a lot of those compromises again, but it really is a series of compromises. Some compromises worked, like the Connecticut Compromise with representation in Congress, and obviously other compromises did not work, most notably to try and solve the issue between slave and non-slave states. But it really is very much this series of compromises. The Constitution, as we said, as a social contract, is there to limit the power of government. And we do it through separation of powers and through federalism. Another of the Federalist Papers that was assigned for this week is Federalist number 51, again, written by James Madison. And Federalist 51 talks about the idea of limiting power through separation of powers. But if the Constitution is all about limiting the power of government and expressing what are the appropriate powers for national government versus state governments, I think we really need to button up this issue of power. We've talked about power a lot over the last 45 minutes. We haven't really taken a step back and really defined what we mean by power. So my question for you is, what is power? Give me a quick definition of power. What do we mean by power?
Someone who has authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's someone who has authority over someone else. Someone, and through authority, we're talking about, it could be resources, it could be position, but they have some type of authority basis over someone else and can use that authority basis then for the purpose of influencing the actions of that other individual. So when we exercise power, we're using our position or our resources in order to try and influence someone else to take an action we want them to take. And sometimes to take an action that they otherwise would not take on their own volition, that they would not normally do this, but we want to try and influence them to do it. We are exercising power when we are doing that. There's a really great book, and it kind of comes out of the world of sociology, but a really great book by John Gaventa from a few decades ago, but I think it still rings true today. And what John Gaventa wanted to do is he really wanted to get at this issue of power. And he really wanted to try and clearly define what was power. And so what he did is he went into a coal mine town in rural Appalachia. And so he goes in this coal mine town. And if you're familiar with coal mine towns, especially how they used to work back 100 years ago or so, or even back 30 or 40 years ago, is that in coal mine towns, the towns were completely dominated by the coal mine company. So the coal mine company would employ almost everyone in town. So if you were living in that town and you were working, chances are you were working for the coal mine company. The coal mine company would have people working in the mines. If you know anything about coal mining, you know that coal mining is a very dangerous job. It's a dangerous job because obviously you're working underground. Sometimes those mines can be very unstable. Sometimes in the process of mining, you end up producing some gases, and those gases are highly combustible and highly flammable. So mines have these nasty tendencies to collapse. They have these nasty tendencies to explode. So they're very dangerous conditions. The coal mine companies were sending the miners down into these mines to work sometimes 70 and 80-hour weeks in these very dangerous types of conditions. There's a process in coal mining that's known as dusting. And one way in which you can control or limit the propensity of a mine to explode is by doing this dusting process. So you dust the mine, and when you dust the mine, you can kind of tamp down some of the gases to make it less likely that they'll escape and then hit a flame and explode. So dusting greatly reduces the risk of explosion, makes mining a bit more safe than it otherwise would be. Obviously, dusting is costly for coal mine owners to do. And so to cut back on costs, this coal mine company had not dusted the mine in many years. So they weren't doing dusting to try and save money, which made the mines even more dangerous places to work. So coal miners are working these mines 70 and 80-hour weeks. And when they were getting paid, they weren't getting paid in money. They were getting paid in tokens. So the coal mine company would issue them tokens for their weekly work. Those tokens could only then be redeemed at, you guessed it, the company store. So the one store in town was owned by the coal mine. And so the coal mine owners gave you the tokens. You could only use them at the general store. And then those tokens went right back to the coal mine owners. And so it kind of, they had the coal mine workers both ways. So it was a really terrible existence for a lot of these coal mine workers. And what Gaventa wanted to know is, why were they doing it? Why were these coal mine companies so successful at getting these coal miners to work in these dangerous conditions, to work for tokens, without really complaining about it, without really lodging a lot of complaints against the coal mine company. What Gaventa found is that the coal mine company was able to effectively exercise power and influence over these coal mine workers, and that there were 3 different types of power that he was able to identify, what he called 3 different faces of power. According to Gaventa, the first type or the first face of power is what he called, or I like to use the term, overt power. Overt power is when you influence someone, you know you're influencing them, and they know that you're influencing them as well. That both parties know what is going on. So back, when we used to teach on campus, I would always use the example of, you get your midterm exam, your assessment back, you don't like the score on the midterm assessment. You come up behind me and you push me out of the 3rd floor window in the SSPA building. And I fall to, probably not my death, but maybe, I don't know, my maiming or whatever. It's only 3 floors, but you push me out the window. You know you're pushing me out the window. If I see you coming, I know you're the one who pushed me out the window. We both know what's going on. It's overt exercise of power. Now, Gaventa argues that that first face of power, that overt exercise of power, is probably the least dangerous type of power, unless you're the one falling out the window, obviously, but it's the least dangerous type of power because everyone knows what's going on. There's nothing hidden. There are no punches being pulled. We all know who's exercising the power and who's the one who's being influenced. That's overt power. Second face of power, though, is a little bit more hidden, and that's what he calls mobilization of bias. The best way to think about mobilization of bias is think about agenda setting. So when you take your policy class, you'll spend a lot of time talking about agenda setting, and we'll talk about it in this class in a few weeks. But before a policy can be made, an issue needs to get onto the formal decision-making agenda of a formal legislative body. So before you can get a state law, that issue has to get onto the agenda of that state legislature. You can keep the issue off of the agenda, and if you're able to exercise power by keeping the issue off the agenda, no law will ever be made on that issue. And that's what's called agenda setting, mobilization of bias. This is what the coal mine owners were doing. They were giving contributions to members of the state legislature in order for those state legislators to keep issues of coal mine safety off the agenda. Coal mine workers only knew that nothing was being done. They knew no laws were being passed for coal mine safety. They didn't really know why. Well, the why is because it never got onto the agenda of the state legislature because the coal mine owners were able to influence state legislators to keep those issues off of the agenda. So mobilization, agenda setting is the second face of power, and that's one aspect of power that was going on in this coal mine town. The third, and according to Gaventa, most dangerous type or face of power is what he called co-optation. Co-optation is when you can replace someone's opinions with your own. So the coal mine owners were able to convince the coal miners that it was in their best interest to get paid in tokens. It was in their best interest to work in these dangerous mine conditions for 70 and 80-hour weeks, because what was in the best interest of the company was, by extension, the best interest of the coal mine workers. So when you are able to co-opt the opinion of someone else and replace their opinion and what's in their best interest with your opinion and what's in your best interest, that is the third, and what Gaventa says, most dangerous type of power. And it's, again, the most dangerous type of power because the people who are having power exerted over them, the people who are having their opinions co-opted, oftentimes do not even know that it is happening. So it's a very solid, very hidden exercise of power, a way in which you can influence people to do something that they otherwise would not do, and oftentimes to take actions that are actually counter to their own rational self-interest. So why do I mention Gaventa and spend some time talking about these 3 different faces of power? I think it's a fascinating theory, and I think it's an important one for us, because throughout this class, we are going to talk about the issue of power. After the break, when we go through the Constitution, we're going to talk about the powers of Congress. We're going to talk about the powers of the executive branch. We're going to talk about the powers of the judiciary. We'll talk about powers of national governments versus powers of state governments. We're going to use power extensively, not just tonight, but throughout the entire course. And as we use that term power, I want you to keep in mind how multifaceted power can really be. It can be overt, it can be used through agenda setting, or it could be an actual co-optation of someone else's opinion in order to influence them to do something they otherwise would not do. So just keep this Gaventa typology of different faces of power in mind, because we're going to go back to it as we talked about the issue of power throughout the remainder of the class. But I just think, sometimes we do ourselves a disservice because we talk about power, but we never really delve into the issue of power and really talk about what power is and different types of power. So just kind of keep that definition that we'll use going forward in the future. So as we said, our system of government is predicated upon limiting the power of government horizontally through separation of powers, and then also vertically through our system of federalism. I think we probably all have a pretty good sense of the separation of powers between executive and legislative and judicial branches. But what we don't talk a lot about is the separation of power vertically between different levels of government. And so let's talk a bit about this idea of federalism and the vertical separation of powers, and talk about kind of how that separation of powers vertically in our system of federalism has developed over the past 200 plus years. Because the system of federalism that was established in the US Constitution back in the 1780s looks a lot different than the system of federalism we currently have today. So the whole idea of federalism is, again, we're going to divide powers and duties and responsibilities between different levels of government. From the late 1700s, from the ratification of the Constitution, up to the beginning of the Civil War, so up to 1861, the way in which we divided power and authority between the different levels of government is an era of what we refer to as the period of dual federalism. So we call dual federalism. In dual federalism, both the national and state governments had their own sphere of influence. So there were certain functions the national government did, certain functions that state governments did. The sphere of influence for the national government from the 1780s to 1861 was relatively small in comparison to state governments. And so state governments had more responsibilities typically than the national government did, and more power in a lot of different policy areas than what we saw in the national government. So if you're going to kind of, draw this out and diagram this, you basically have two different circles. You'd have a small circle for the national government, a larger circle for the state government, and then those two circles are separate from each other, in that they do not overlap. They have different spheres of influence. So it's called dual federalism. Some federalism scholars will also refer to that as what they call their coordinate authority model of federalism. I'll put that in our text chat. They call it the coordinate authority model of federalism. Coordinate authority model of federalism being, again, two different spheres of authority. The two are separate from each other. They don't overlap with each other. Then we get to the Civil War. And in the lead up to the Civil War, we had a situation where Southern states were beginning to ignore some of the laws that were being passed by Congress. Southern states, because their economies were based upon slavery, felt that Congress is dominated by northern states, by non-slave states, and so they feared that slavery would be eroded, and a lot of the laws coming out of Congress were to erode the institution of slavery. So what Southern states started to do is, like I said, they started to ignore a lot of these laws coming out of Congress. One thing they started doing is engaging in a practice known as interposition. And again, I'm going to put these terms in text chat for you. Engaging in what was called interposition. Interposition was a strategy that Southern states used when they disagreed with a law coming out of Congress. They'd say, we are going to use our state resources to block the implementation of that law. So they would accept that, yes, this is a law that's being handed down to us, but we are going to block its implementation because we don't agree with the law. And so they'll use their resources to block implementation. That was a practice, again, known as interposition. Interposition didn't work all that well. And so they then moved to their next strategy, and their next strategy was then nullification. And in nullification, what the southern states would do is they would just declare a law coming out of Congress as null and void. Now, Congress does not have the constitutional ability to tell us what to do on this issue. So when they try and do it, we're going to just declare this law to be completely null and void. So we don't recognize its legality. And so therefore, obviously, we're not going to follow that law. When interposition and nullification failed, then the next step was obviously succession. And they were then secede from the Union. And we saw then South Carolina being the first state to secede from the Union in the run-up then to the war in 1861. Interposition, nullification, and then finally secession, those three strategies were all based upon the idea of states' rights. Advocates of interposition, nullification, and secession argued that it was the states who put the Union together to begin with. The states chose to join the Union. They created the Union. And so if the states created the Union and chose to join the Union, then they have the constitutional and legal ability to remove themselves from that Union as well. So this states' rights type of philosophy was a philosophy that they based secession on. We formed the Union, we created it, so therefore we can leave it and essentially destroy it if it's no longer serving our purposes as state governments. The problem with that argument is that the roots for that argument were actually sown by some of the framers. And James Madison, we talk a lot about James Madison here because he essentially wrote the Constitution. But James Madison in Federalist Paper number 39, which I also provided for you for this class, in Federalist number 39, Madison kind of deals with this issue of, is the Constitution a national type of government or is it more of a federal type of government? And by his definition, federal meant more controlled by the states. So is it national, controlled by the national government, or was it more federal, controlled by state governments, like you would see in a federation or a confederation? And one of the strategies he uses in that article is to say, well, let's look at all these different aspects of the Constitution. So let's look at how the Constitution was created. Is it national or federal? Let's look at how the government's going to be operated and administered. Is that national or is that federal? Let's look at representation. Is that national or federal? Let's look at how we amend the Constitution. Is that national or federal? It really is a brilliant way of deconstructing the Constitution into its different elements in order to convince the citizens of New York that this Constitution was not overly national, that it really was more of a federal Constitution that allowed states to retain their sovereignty and retain their rights. Because the problem, as you know, is when the Constitution was approved at the Constitutional Convention, in order for it to be ratified, you had to have 9 states out of the 13 ratify it before the Constitution went into effect. And relatively quickly after its passage, it was ratified by those 9 states. So it went into effect. The problem was New York was not one of those 9 states. New York was the largest state. New York was really where most commerce was happening in the colonies at the time. Really all commerce flowed through the ports at New York. And if you didn't have New York agreeing to this new Constitution, you really didn't have a functioning government. So they needed to convince the citizens of New York to ratify this new Constitution. Well, that's what the Federalist Papers were all about. They were written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay for the purpose of convincing the citizens of New York to ratify this new Constitution. So in Federalist 39, that's exactly what Madison's doing. He said, let's pull the Constitution apart, look at it in detail, and I'll prove to you it's a good balance between the national and the federal approach. It's not wholly national, it's not wholly states' rights, it's a perfect balance between the two. But in doing so, one of the arguments he makes is with the origin of the Constitution. And he argues that the Constitution was not a national document because it was created by representatives from states, that the states created the Constitution, the states created this new union. And again, when he was writing Federalist 39, it made sense why he made that argument, because he was trying to convince New Yorkers that the state of New York would retain its rights under this Constitution. So you understand why he did it. But the problem is that those words then, once we fast forward into the 1850s and 1860s, those words were then used by states' rights advocates to support secession, saying, look, James Madison, the framers, even said that this union was created by the states, and so we created the union, we can then leave the union. So it was almost unfortunate the way those words were then used that led up then to the Civil War. But the Civil War occurs then in 1861 through 1865. Once the Civil War ends and the Union wins, we move from this era of dual federalism into a second era of federalism known as competitive federalism. Now, competitive federalism looks a lot like dual federalism, but the big difference is that that national sphere of influence that was very small grows exponentially. And it does so at the detriment of the state sphere of influence. So in competitive federalism, your national circle of influence gets bigger, your state circle of influence gets smaller. The reason for that is that power and authority in a federal system is really oftentimes what we call a zero-sum game. And we talk a lot in public administration about some economic theories, and one of those economic theories is game theory. And one type of game theory is zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, if one participant in the game is going to win, by definition, the other participant has to lose. So if one participant increases their authority, they take that authority away from the other participant. And that's kind of what happened here in competitive federalism. National government grew its sphere of influence, and that came at the erosion of state government influence. You think what the national government started getting involved in the 1800s into the early 1900s. They got involved in regulating the economy, regulating food safety, regulating worker safety and workplace safety, regulating interstate commerce, regulating pharmaceutical drugs. I mean, you name it. And the federal government the national government started regulating all these different things that they had never regulated before. Any regulations of those things in the past usually belong to state governments. So from the end of the Civil War in 1865 up until the stock market crash and the FDR administration, we were in this competitive federalism type of era. Then the stock market crashes, and then we have the Great Depression. FDR comes in, the White House gets elected, comes in the election of 1932, and brings with him his New Deal programs. New Deal programs, as you know, to try and help pull states and the economy out of the Great Depression. A lot of the programs in the New Deal were based upon cooperation between national and state governments. So the national government would create a program and provide grant money to state governments, so state governments could use that grant money in order to try and pull themselves out of the Great Depression. So the period of federalism, beginning with the FDR administration, so if you want to put a date on, it's like 1932 when FDR was elected, up until the mid-1960s, is what we call cooperative federalism. Some federalism scholars will refer to it as fiscal federalism, just because a lot of this cooperation was being done via grants and via money. So relationship between national and state governments was really being defined by the granting of money from the national governments. Once we get this cooperative type of era of federalism, our model of federalism then changes. And instead of it being a coordinate authority where the two spheres of influence were separate, it now becomes an overlapping authority model of federalism. And the overlapping authority model, if you're drawing a Venn diagram, your two circles then start to overlap with each other. So there are still some things only the national government does, some things only states do, but then you have this gray area in between where your circles overlap, And those are shared functions between the national and state governments, and then eventually local governments get included in that as well. So you got this cooperative federalism, this overlapping authority model, up until the mid-1960s. And after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president, then gets reelected in the election of 1964. And Lyndon Johnson had a different approach to the balance of power between different levels of government. Lyndon Johnson was a creature of Congress. So he spent a lot, he was a teacher, and then he ended up getting elected to Congress and spent most of his political life in Congress. So he really did believe in the ability of Congress to make national laws and to solve problems with a national type of a focus. So when Johnson came into office, he ushered in a new era of federalism known as creative federalism. And creative federalism brought with it a third model known as the inclusive authority model. The inclusive authority model, now you take your spheres of influence, you take your circles, and you put the local circle inside the state circle, because local governments are creatures of the state. And you put the state circle inside the national circle, because the national government is really exercising its power over state governments as well as local governments. So you've got your circles all within this bigger circle for the national government. What Johnson did is Johnson started using grants, which are very specific, known as categorical grants, and we'll talk more about those later in the term when we talk about how you manage fiscal resources. So you use categorical grants, very specific grants, where state and local governments, when they got the money, they really didn't have a lot of authority over how to spend it. They had to spend it the way the national government was telling them to spend it. He also used another approach known as mandates, and a mandate is an order. So a mandate is when the federal government comes in and tells state governments or local governments, you must do this under penalty of law. And the state and local governments really have no choice but to follow those orders. So a mandate is an order. If you want to think about it this way, the grants approach is equivalent to the carrot. So you give them a carrot, you give them money to get them to do something. And if that doesn't work, then you use the mandate, and the mandate then is the stick approach. So if the carrot doesn't work, you then hit the state or local government over the head with the stick. But it was all predicated upon this idea that local power was subsumed within state power, state authority was then subsumed within national authority. Then very soon after that, we have the election of 1968, and Richard Nixon comes into the White House. Richard Nixon brought with him a new approach to federalism that federalism scholars, being the creative bunch that we are, refer to as new federalism. New federalism is kind of the opposite of creative federalism. In new federalism, we're returning to the idea of states' rights. We're returning to the idea of state authority, and the idea that the best place to make decisions is at the level closest to the citizen. They can be much more effective and much more efficient if decisions are made at the local level or the state level, as opposed to being made, thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. So what Reagan did when Reagan came into office in 1981 is to replace a lot of these very specific categorical grants with what were called block grants. Block grants are much more flexible types of grant programs that will allow state and local governments to use the money however they see fit, as long as the way they're spending the money will help them achieve the goals of the national program. So again, you're trusting state and local governments to go out there and spend the money in the appropriate manner. Also took a lot of those mandates and removed those mandates through a process known as deregulation. So remove those regulations and those orders from state and local governments as well as from private industry, again, to try and free up those entities to make their own decisions. We kind of see a renewal of Nixon federalism once we get into the Reagan administration in 1981. And we kind of call Reagan's approach new federalism, because it was kind of a redo of what Nixon did in 1969 through when he resigned in 1974. So we kind of call Reagan's approach new federalism, a redo of the Nixon approach. Where we are today in terms of federalism, just to cut to the chase, because I know we're running long in the tooth tonight. I would argue, and this is my term, that we are in an era of federalism that I like to call contextual federalism. And what I mean by contextual federalism is our approach to answering the question of which level of government holds the power really does depend upon the issue and the context of the situation that we are dealing with. It's no longer ideologically driven. It's now issue driven. So you'll see an administration on one issue want to centralize power at the national level and take control over that issue. Then on a separate issue, that same administration may say, let's turn the decision-making over to local governments. So your approach about who has the authority and power under contextual federalism is based upon the issue rather than any type of a political ideology. The upshot of that for us as students of public administration is that it makes it more difficult for us to study federalism. When it's contextual and issue-based, it's much more difficult for us to predict what an administration is going to do from a federalism perspective than back in the day when it used to be ideologically based. So when it was ideologically based, if it was a conservative administration, they would favor states' rights and state and local power. If it was a liberal administration, they would favor national decision-making and the decision-making residing at the national level in Washington, D.C. It's not that easy anymore. It really does depend upon the individual issue. But the important moral of the story here is that federalism and this vertical separation and division of power is really a very dynamic concept. It's a dynamic concept that has changed in a very profound way from 1789 up until our current modern point in time. One thing that I always tell all of my classes, I didn't tell you this last week, but I'll tell you it this week, is that for all of my courses, I have one favorite answer and one favorite question. My favorite answer is, it depends. And I always answer it depends because the answer really does depend upon the situation in public administration. There's a very famous organization theorist called Mary Parker Follett, one of my favorites. And Mary Parker Follett argues for managing and leading by the situation. So depending upon the situation, there could be one answer that is appropriate and another answer that's not quite as appropriate. In an it depends type of approach, we're never really looking for the quote unquote best answer, but rather we're looking for what we consider to be the most appropriate answer. So what solution or what approach is most appropriate for this public agency dealing with this public problem, with this set of public actors at this current point in time? So I think, again, they're very contextual type of an approach. My favorite question is always, so what? So here we have talked for the past hour and 20 minutes about the foundations of American government and separation of powers and federalism and what is power and all these great topics. So what? So what does all this mean for us in public administration and as students of public administration? Well, the first thing it means in answering this so what question is that it's clear that we as public administrators serve many masters in the American democratic system. We serve the judiciary. We serve the executive. We serve the legislative branch. We serve national governments. The national government. We serve state governments. We have many, many different masters in the system of American government. Having those many masters means that for public administrators, there can be conflicting directions given. That you may have one directive coming out of an executive office and a different directive coming out of the legislature in terms of the legislation that is passed. Then you may have a third directive coming out of the judiciary as a result of court cases that have been brought to the courts. So many masters mean many different conflicting types of directions that we're being pulled and pushed in on a daily basis as public administrators. Our system of American government also means that we have a complex network of cooperation and competition between other public agencies, between public agencies and nonprofit agencies, and between public agencies and private sector agencies in order to get the work of the people done. We have to work within these networks, create and work within networks to cooperate with all these other entities and all these other groups. But as Madison tells us, since it is a democracy, there's also going to be competition as these different factions and these different groups come into conflict with each other. So the networks in which we operate in the American system of government are going to be very complex types of networks. And basically what our system of American government does is it creates for us a unique environment of public administration. And this is a theory known as the ecology of public administration. And the ecology of public administration, which is usually attributed to a gentleman by the name of John Gauss, G-A-U-S. John Gauss argues in the ecology of administration, public administration, is to understand what our organizations do and what our administrators do and why they take the actions and engage in the behaviors they engage in. You need to understand the environment that surrounds them. So John Gauss kind of likened it to a living organism. So you think about like a plant. And if you want to explain why that plant is growing or not growing the way in which it is, you would have to look at the amount of sunlight the plant gets, the placement of that plant in the room, how much water the plant gets, how much fertilizer the plant gets. Some people say how much you talk to the plant, but you really have to understand the ecology, the environment that surrounds that plant. But it's the same thing here in public administration. To understand what's going on in public administration, we have to understand the environment that surrounds public agencies. And because of our system of American government, the environment that surrounds our public agencies is inherently a very political environment. Since we're operating within a political environment, we kind of blur those lines between politics and administration. And one of the readings you have coming up in a couple of weeks, which is really the basic reading in public administration that really started the whole discipline of public administration, is the one by Woodrow Wilson, The Study of Administration from 1887. And Wilson, in his 1887 article, provides us this argument about the politics administration dichotomy. But he recognizes in his politics administration dichotomy that politics will always be what he calls the touchstone of administration. So whenever we decide what is the most effective or most efficient way to carry out our administrative tasks as public administrators, we always have to keep an eye on the political environment and the political implications. So even though we are administrators, there are sometimes political roles that we do have to play in order gaining support from our constituencies and from our client groups who are dependent upon the programs and the services that we are creating as a public agency. So the basic moral is you cannot understand public administration without understanding the American political environment, the context in which that administration actually occurs. And so that's why it was instructive tonight for us to spend quite a bit of time kind of going back and hitting the highlights of where our system of American government came from, because all of our public agencies are rooted within that American political environment. So if we understand the environment, that gives us a step ahead in terms of trying to understand our agencies, what they do, and why they take the actions and behaviors that they engage in. But again, all of these different roles and all these different powers, they're embodied within this contract between the citizens and their governments. And in our system of government, that contract is our Constitution. So since we've been at this for a while, let's go ahead and take a break. So let's take about a 15-minute break. I would say come on back at, let's call it 5:40. When we come back at 5:40, we'll answer any questions on this information. Then we'll go through the Constitution and kind of show you within this contract where the power lies and which level of government has power over which certain types of duties and responsibilities. So to take a break, come back at 5:40, and we'll jump headfirst into the U.S. Constitution. Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. Now, in the second half of class, as I said, we're going to talk about the Constitution. But before we get into that, I know we covered a lot of ground in the first half of class. We basically spent an hour and 25 minutes doing what you probably would normally do in about 8 weeks in an American government class. And so I apologize for that. But again, in an 8-week class, we have really limited contracted time frame. So we got to do what we can as quickly as we can. So are there any questions on any of the material we covered on the foundations of American government in the first half of class tonight? Everybody good? Hopefully most of that information was just a review and kind of refreshed your memory a little bit from your undergraduate American government classes. And so hopefully none of that was too terribly new. The Gaventa information probably was a little new because I don't know if he's taught in a lot of classes, but again, I think it's a really good framework that we can carry with us over the next several weeks, whenever the term or the issue power comes up. And the issue of power is going to come up quite a bit as we go through the Constitution, because after all, that's what the framers did, is they established a social contract to try and separate powers between, again, executive, legislative, and judicial, as well as between different levels of government in our system of federalism. So I'm not going to go word for word through the Constitution, but I do think it's useful for us to, every now and then take a step back and look at the Constitution, because the Constitution really is this contract between us as representatives in the government and citizens. And so it's important that we always keep our eye on what this contract really says. And there are a lot of members of Congress, at least years ago, I don't know how many do that today, but a lot years ago, who would carry around a copy of the Constitution with them at all times. Bob Dole, when he was in the Senate, always used to carry around a copy of the Constitution, and then he also carry around a copy of the Federalist Papers, just to kind of remind himself of this contract between the government and citizens. So the Constitution, two things about the Constitution. One is, as we said in the first half of class, it is a series of compromises. Some compromises good, some compromises bad, but it's a series of compromises. And secondly, it is a very well organized document, in that the Constitution is broken up into 7 separate articles, each article dealing with a different topic area, and then 27 amendments that have been added to the Constitution over the past 200 plus years. So what that tells us is that we don't amend the Constitution very often. If we have over 200 years and only 27 amendments, and 10 of those amendments all came at once in the Bill of Rights, we don't really change the Constitution very often. We do interpret the Constitution, though. And so there's been a lot of concern in the judicial branch about judicial activism and the courts rewriting the Constitution or interpreting the Constitution in different ways, depending upon who happens to be on the court at that given time. So the Constitution is, in that respect, a dynamic document, but from the aspect of actually amending it, tends to be relatively static in nature. Let's go ahead and go through the 7 main articles of the Constitution. Again, not going through it word by word and line by line, but just really pulling out the most important aspects of the Constitution that can have impact upon us as public servants. So we know Article 1 of the Constitution is the lengthiest article. It's the most detailed article, and it talks about the legislative branch. Because the legislative branch is discussed first in Article 1, and because Article 1 is the most detailed article, there are a lot of political scientists, me included, who will argue that Congress is the first branch of government, and that the framers intended for Congress to be the first branch of government. In Article 1, Section 1, the framers established, again, this bicameral legislature, this 2-house legislature. All legislative powers are vested in a Congress, which will consist of a Senate and the House of Representatives. We know the Senate was designed to be the upper house, the House of Representatives designed to be the lower house, the House of Representatives as the lower house being closer to the people, the Senate being more deliberative and being farther away from individual citizens. Article 1, Section 2 then talks about the U.S. House of Representatives. So if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you serve very short terms. You only serve 2-year terms. The framers did that on purpose because they wanted, again, members of the House to be accountable to the voters, to the citizens. So you serve a 2-year term. You are elected directly by the people. And so it's a direct election type of process. In order to be in the House of Representatives, you need to be at least 25 years old, and you need to be a citizen of your state for at least 7 years. We also know that let's go like this. The House of Representatives also has the ability to establish its own officers, but the one officer that is mentioned in the Constitution for the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. And so that's the one constitutional position in the House of Representatives. And then we also know that the House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment. Now, in recent years, we've lived through 2 presidential impeachment processes, and so you're probably somewhat familiar with the way in which impeachments work. But impeachment starts in the House of Representatives, and the House then will pass articles of impeachment. Once those articles of impeachment are passed, they're essentially kind of similar to an indictment as we would have in the criminal justice system. Once those articles are passed by the House, then impeachment goes over to the Senate, and a trial is then held in the Senate. So the House does the impeachment, the Senate does the trial. So impeachment only occurs in the House, the trial only occurs over in the Senate. Then Section 3 gets into the Senate and talks about the Senate. Terms for senators are 6 years in duration. Senators under the original Constitution were not directly elected. Senators were selected by state legislatures. The framers did that on purpose because they wanted the Senate to be a more deliberative body. They wanted senators to kind of be from, the upper crust of society, if you will. They didn't have complete trust in citizens to elect their own representatives, and so that's why they are indirectly elected by state legislatures. Again, they serve these very long 6-year terms, and the Senate is broken up into thirds. So every 2 years, you'll have 1/3 of the Senate coming up for re-election so that everyone doesn't turn over all at the same time. In order to be a senator, you have to be at least 30 years old, and you have to be a citizen of your state of the United States for at least 9 years. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. The vice president, when she is serving as the president of the Senate, only votes in the case of a tie. That's the only time that the vice president can vote as president of the Senate. The Senate has the ability constitutionally to choose its own officers like the House does, but the position that is the constitutional position in the Senate is what's called the president pro tem. The president pro tem of the Senate is a position that is elected by the Senate, but it's a position that traditionally goes to the longest serving member from the majority party. So your president pro tem of the Senate is Patrick Leahy from the state of Vermont. The president of the Senate, the president pro tem of the Senate, is the one who operates the Senate and runs the Senate whenever the vice president is not in the seat. And usually what happens is the president pro tem of the Senate will not run the day-to-day operations. You'll have individual senators who will be selected by their party to actually go and preside over the day-to-day operations of the Senate. The Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. And so when articles of impeachment come from the House and arrive in the Senate, before that they can have the trial, all senators have to take an oath or affirmation. And if you watched any of the last 2 presidential impeachment trials, you saw them stand up and take their oath or affirmation. Some senators weren't there for the oath, so they had to do it later, but technically they're all supposed to be there whenever the oath is administered. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court presides over those impeachment trials. In order to find someone guilty, if you will, or to convict someone of impeachment, you need to have, and remove them from office, you need to have a 2/3 vote of the Senate. So it's only a simple majority to pass articles of impeachment in the House, but it's a 2/3 majority to then find someone guilty and have them removed from office. You can find someone guilty of the charges in the impeachment, articles of impeachment, without necessarily removing them from office. It's kind of like this 2-step process, and that was one of the big discussions that was had in the second Trump impeachment, because he was at the end of his term and already was leaving office. And the question was, well, what's the use then of doing it? Well, the use is that you can still find the person guilty on the articles of impeachment, and you can then also bar them from holding future office. And so that was the real question, is that he was leaving office. So if you find him guilty, you then have the ability to bar him from future office. And yes, you do, but you don't necessarily have to do that. So you find them guilty, they then leave office, but you don't necessarily have to bar them from future office. And in the past, the Senate usually does, when they find someone guilty of impeachment, guilty of those charges, which they've done for judges, not for presidents, but for judges they've done, and they've then barred them from holding future offices of public trust. But you don't necessarily have to do that. Times and places and manner of holding elections under the auspices of the Senate. And you can read all the rest of the provisions, but that establishes the Senate that's indirectly elected by state legislatures, serving very long 6-year terms, meant to be the deliberative body as compared to the House of Representatives. So things happen a lot slower in the Senate than they would normally happen over in the House of Representatives. A really important part of Article 1, Section 7 is this provision about revenue bills. So any bill that is raising revenue must begin in the House of Representatives. And again, that was done for the specific reason that you want to make sure that, since taxation is closer to the people, it's something that is more important to the people, that it begins in the House that's closest to the people as well. So revenue bills are supposed to start in the House and then move over to the Senate. In order for a bill to become a law, that bill must pass the House and the Senate in identical format before being signed by the president. So what that means is, when the bill comes out of the House, it may look different than the bill that came out of the Senate. That's why we then have conference committees, and members are then selected as conferees. So you'll have a certain number from the House, a certain number from the Senate. They will sit on this conference committee. They will hammer out the details of the bill to make the bill uniform. Then it then goes back to the floor of the House, back to the floor of the Senate for final passage before it then goes to the president. And that's, again, what slows down a lot of the legislating process, because if you have one body that's controlled by one party, another body controlled by another party, it's very difficult to get uniform versions of the bill passed by both of those bodies. It also is difficult when you have a very slim Democratic majority in the House and you have an equally divided Senate. Again, it makes it very difficult to get a lot of this legislation passed. We also know the Senate operates differently than the House. The Senate is a much more collegial, much more egalitarian body, which means that they deliberate a lot more. Things move a lot slower in the Senate than they do in the House. And the process by which a bill gets to the floor of the House is different than how it gets to the floor of the Senate. In order for a bill to get to the floor of the House, and we're not going to go through all the steps or anything, we're not going to make it a civics class, but when it comes out of committee, before it can get to the floor of the House, it must first go through what's called a Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee will then pass a rule that will govern how that piece of legislation will be debated on the floor. So the amount of time that's allowed for debate, the number and types of amendments that can be proposed, all that goes into a rule that then allows that bill to go to the floor of the House. In the Senate, whenever a bill comes out of committee, a bill goes to the floor of the Senate through what's called a UCA, which stands for a Unanimous Consent Agreement. And I'm typing and talking at the same time. Unanimous Consent Agreement. Unanimous Consent Agreement means that all senators must agree before the bill can get to the floor. Now, you might think that would be difficult. Why would everyone agree if you're vehemently opposed to a piece of legislation? Well, the reason why is because of a process known in Congress as log rolling. Log rolling is kind of a quid pro quo. So I'm not going to stop your legislation from getting to the floor, because then you won't stop mine. If I stop your piece of legislation, you're going to stop my piece of legislation. And so it's kind of this quid pro quo. I won't stop your piece, you won't stop mine. So as you can see, they will operate much differently. Debate in the House of Representatives is very strictly managed. Debate in the Senate can be almost unlimited. In the Senate, you can filibuster a lot of things, not everything anymore. You know, the filibuster has been a heated topic of debate lately. Back when Senator Reid was the majority leader of the Senate, they got rid of the filibuster for certain types of things, and they got rid of the filibuster for things such as certain, judicial nominations. Filibustering is when you stop the consideration of legislation by kind of just killing time. And so you've seen in the past, senators will get up there and for 30 or 40 hours straight, they will read from a magazine, or they will read from in the past, they'd read from the DC area phone book just to stop the consideration of legislation. The way in which you break up a filibuster and get a bill passed is through something called a vote of cloture. And it's the T and not the S, a vote of cloture. A vote of cloture requires 60 votes. So if you can get 60 senators to agree to stop a filibuster and proceed with a piece of legislation, you have won what's called a vote of cloture, and then consideration can then proceed. So as you can see, they operate much differently from each other, but they establish their own rules as provided for in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 is a very important part of the Constitution, because in Article 1, Section 8 is where we talk about the powers of Congress. What types of powers and duties does the Congress have? And what kind of powers and duties does the Congress have versus what state and local governments have? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But in Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to do things such as to weigh and collect taxation. Congress has the power to tax. However, under the original Constitution, that was a limited power to tax. Congress had the power to tax, but all taxes had to be apportioned according to state populations, what's known as the apportionment clause. So all these taxes had to be apportioned according to population, meaning that more populous states would pay more of their share in taxation than less populous states. So under the original Constitution, the direct individual income tax that we all know and love today was unconstitutional. And even today, you'll have some people say, don't pay your income taxes because your income taxes are unconstitutional. That's very poor advice. Don't listen to them. The IRS will not be happy if you listen to them. You indeed do have to pay your federal income taxes because of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. So in 1913, we ratified the 16th Amendment that gives Congress the ability to levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. There's a huge, broad grant of power to Congress that says they can tax anything they want to tax. So that made the federal income tax constitutional. So make sure to pay your taxes. The Congress can also borrow money, and we're painfully aware of Congress's propensity for borrowing money. They can regulate commerce. This is what's called the Commerce Clause, to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among several states, and with Indian tribes. This Commerce Clause is a really big part of Article 1, Section 8. When Congress tries to extend its powers over state and local governments, one of the ways in which it extends its powers is by relying upon this Commerce Clause. So if Congress tells a state government it must do something, the questions the courts will ask, number one, is this related to interstate commerce? Is there any nexus between this legislation and any trade that's going on between the states? If it is related to interstate commerce, the courts will usually take a hands-off approach and will sanction congressional intervention in that issue. If Congress cannot prove that this law is related to interstate commerce, then it becomes a little bit more difficult for Congress to prove that that law is constitutional. So that Commerce Clause is a really big part of the congressional expansion of power that we have seen over the past several decades. To establish uniform rules of naturalization and laws of bankruptcies, to coin money. As we said in the Articles of Confederation, it was difficult to have a uniform currency. Now only Congress has the ability to coin money and set the value of money. to provide for punishment, counterfeiting of securities in the current coin of the United States so they can punish counterfeiting, to establish post offices is also another power of Congress, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And so, National Science Foundation comes directly out of that. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. One line that is extremely important. What this essentially means is that Congress had the ability to set up the entire federal judiciary with the exception of the U.S. Supreme Court. So every court inferior to the U.S. Supreme Court, all those courts of appeal, all those district trial courts we have at the federal level, all were established by Congress in the Judiciary Act. So a huge grant of power. To define and punish piracies and felonies on the high seas. To declare war, only Congress may declare war, presidents may not. Presidents can engage in military action for a period of time, send troops into harm's way, but they cannot actually declare war. Only a declaration of war can come from Congress. So if the president wants to declare war, they will have to go before a joint session of Congress, and Congress would then have to approve that request for a declaration of war. We saw that happen in World War I. We also saw that happen in World War II. In World War I, there were several votes in Congress against declaring war. One of those people was a representative named Jeanette Rankin. Then in World War II, there was only one vote against going to war in World War II, and that was again Jeanette Rankin. So she was the only person in Congress to vote against going to war twice in her career. To raise and support armies, to provide and maintain Navy, again, we needed some type of a national defense, so we weren't just relying upon individual state militias. To make rules of government, regulation of land and naval forces, call forth militia, to execute laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections and to repel invasions. You can go through and read the rest of it. We'll go on down, shoot down to the bottom here, which is a really important part of Article 1, Section 8. This last paragraph in Article 1, Section 8, as you probably know, is what's called the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause. To make all laws which will be necessary and proper for the carrying and execution of foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. In other words, in Article 1, Section 8, we have now enumerated specific powers for Congress. We have listed. When you enumerate, you are listing. So we listed these specific powers that Congress has. Then in Article 1, Section 8, that last paragraph, the elastic clause, we were saying, but Congress can do whatever it needs to, whatever is necessary to allow it to execute all these enumerated powers we've listed in Article 1, Section 8. So when Congress has expanded its power over state and local governments, it's done so, number one, by using the Commerce Clause, and then number two, using this elastic clause. And those are the two huge grants of power to Congress that are very amorphous, very vague in nature, that Congress has relied upon whenever it's tried to expand its power in our system of federalism. So Article 1, Section 8, we have enumerated powers and we have the elastic clause. Now, it might sound strange, but when you enumerate powers, you are by definition limiting those powers. Because when you list the powers that Congress has, by definition, any powers that are not listed, you would assume do not belong to Congress. If we're saying what Congress has, then anything that's not listed is something Congress does not have, unless it can be argued in the elastic clause that it's necessary in order to carry out the enumerated powers. In Article 1, Section 9, we then get into some prohibitions against Congress, some things Congress cannot do. We see Congress cannot ban the slave trade until at least 1808, as we had discussed earlier. Congress cannot deny the writ of habeas corpus, and writ of habeas corpus, as you probably know, literally means to present the body. And so if someone is arrested, you can't hide that person away. You must present, here's the person arrested, this is what that person is being charged with. The writ of habeas corpus cannot be suspended unless it's a case of rebellion or invasion, as public safety may require it. We did see the writ of habeas corpus suspended by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War because of rebellion. And so that was the reason why that was done. No bills of attainder or ex post facto laws shall be passed. A bill of attainder is basically saying someone is guilty without a trial. So you can't just say this person's guilty without that person have the benefit of a trial. That cannot be done. Ex post facto law is an after the fact law. So you can't say, well, this person did this last year when it was legal. We're going to make that act illegal this year and then go back and prosecute that person for engaging in the act before it was illegal. That would be an ex post facto law. Let's see, well, the tax, I already talked about, that's been repealed, the apportionment clause with the 16th Amendment. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations. This is what is known as the appropriations clause, that in order for Congress to spend money, in order for Congress to take money from the Treasury, it must first say how that money is being spent, what that money is being spent on. That's known as the appropriations process. And unfortunately, Congress cannot grant any titles of nobility, so there are no sirs or knighthoods in the future from Congress. So those are limitations on congressional action, section number 9. Article 1, section 10 then lays out some limitations against state government action. Most notably, state governments shall not enter into any treaties and alliances or confederations. That's something that Congress does. States are not allowed to do it. And we'll see in Article 2, the president can initiate a treaty, but that treaty then has to be subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. So that's essentially Article 1 of the Constitution, again, dealing with Congress, laying out the structure of Congress, what Congress can do, what Congress is not allowed to do. Article 2 then turns its attention to the executive branch, to the president. It's a much shorter article without the same specifics that we had in Article 1 that talked about Congress. We understand we have a president. We understand that the term of the presidency will be for 4 years. Initially, the way in which the process worked is the person who came in first became president. The person who came in second became the vice president. You're probably very familiar with the Jefferson administration, and when Jefferson won and Aaron Burr came in second, Aaron Burr became Jefferson's vice president, and Jefferson then moved very quickly to change that, to make sure that essentially presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket, so you didn't have rivals in those two offices. We established the Electoral College, and the Electoral College operates differently today than it operated under the original Constitution. But the way in which the Electoral College operates, as you know, there are 538 electors. In order to become president, you have to win 270 of those 538. You need to win a majority. If no one wins a majority of electors, then the election goes into the House of Representatives for president, and then the Senate then picks the vice president. If there's no majority and the election goes into the House of Representatives, each congressional delegation gets 1 vote. So it's not each member, it's each delegation gets 1 vote to select the next president. A very famous example of this was in 1824, what was called the corrupt bargain. And in 1824, you had Andrew Jackson running against John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and some other candidates, but those were the top 3 candidates. Because it was a split election, Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than the other candidates, and Andrew Jackson also got more electoral votes than the other candidates as well. Problem for Jackson is he didn't get a majority of the Electoral College votes, which meant the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams cut a deal with Henry Clay and essentially told Henry Clay, I will give you a cabinet position if you get your supporters in Congress to support me. So Henry Clay got his supporters to support John Quincy Adams. House of Representatives selected John Quincy Adams, even though he had fewer electoral votes when the election happened and fewer popular votes. John Quincy Adams then became president in what was known as the corrupt bargain. 4 years later, Andrew Jackson then came back and ousted John Quincy Adams and won the White House in overwhelming fashion. But essentially, that's the way in which the Electoral College works. We know in most of our states, with the exception of a couple, we've got a winner-take-all type of system. And so if you win the popular vote in your state, you then get the total number of electors in that state. Total electors in the number of electors in a state is the sum total of the number of representatives you have in the House of Representatives plus your number of senators. So it's your number of representatives in the House plus 2. Because of the census and the enumeration we had in 2020, California is losing one of their votes in the Electoral College because they're losing one of their representatives in the House of Representatives. Some other states are gaining. I believe Texas is gaining 2 because of the increase in their population. So there will be that slight shift in terms of influence in the Electoral College. In order to be president, you have to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural born citizen in order to be president. Presidents are subject to removal from office through the impeachment process. And then we'll talk about the 25th Amendment later, but they can also be removed for disability, and we clarified that with the 25th Amendment. The oath that the president takes is embodied here in Article 2 of the Constitution. That actually became important back in the Obama administration. So when President Obama was first elected, he was given the oath by the Chief Justice, by John Roberts. When he was given the oath by John Roberts, I don't know if Roberts got nervous or whatever, but he messed up the words of the oath and didn't do the oath correctly. Roberts then insisted on the next day redoing the oath in the Oval Office with President Obama to make sure he got it right, because the oath is right there in the Constitution. Shall take the oath. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Framers are very specific about what new presidents have to say. Article 2, Section 2 of Article 2 then starts laying out some of the roles of the president. We won't go through all these. We know the president is commander-in-chief of the military. We know the president is essentially the chief diplomat, and that presidents can enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. We know that presidents are chief executives in that they can appoint members of the federal bureaucracy of the executive branch, again, with confirmation for a lot of those positions by the U.S. Senate. And so a lot of these powers that the president has is shared with the U.S. Senate. But he's basically chief of state, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief executive, all roles played by the president. Again, we're going to skip a lot of the specifics, but just kind of give you the overview of what's in Article number 2. Let's see. Again, we said the president can be removed from office on impeachment, and the language in Article 2, Section 4 says, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. In the last presidential impeachment trials, we really argued a lot about what we mean by high crimes and misdemeanors. What constitutes a high crime? What constitutes a misdemeanor? Not a whole lot of guidance provided for us. In the Federalist Papers, there's a little bit of detail given, but for the most part, the high crimes, that's kind of, in the eye of the beholder. Misdemeanors, that word misdemeanors, a lot of historians will argue that the framers didn't literally mean misdemeanors like we know them today. They knew misdemeanor as a legal term from England, and they thought it was a fancy legal term, and so they threw that in there without a whole lot of thought to the actual import of the term misdemeanor. Then we get into Article 3 that talks about the judicial branch and only really talks about one court. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. All inferior courts are created by Congress. So we establish one Supreme Court. There are no qualifications established to be a Supreme Court justice. There's no minimum age. There's no requirement to be admitted to the bar or to be a lawyer. Constitution is silent on all of that. You do get paid as a member of the Supreme Court, and you serve for life. And so there are no terms as a member of the Supreme Court. It also talks about the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically has two different jurisdictions. One is what's called original jurisdiction, and the other is appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that the case goes directly to the Supreme Court. So it doesn't go through another court first, it goes directly to the Supreme Court. That original jurisdiction would be for an emergency situation, or would be for a situation where it has great, constitutional import that needs to be decided now. extremely rare for any cases to go to the court under original jurisdiction. 99.999999, continue on with that, percent of cases go to the court under appellate jurisdiction, which means that they go through lower courts first and then get appealed up to the Supreme Court. But again, not a whole lot in Article 3, just establish a Supreme Court, establish the jurisdictions, and leave everything else for Congress to figure out in the Judiciary Act. Article 4, important part of Article 4 is this idea called the full faith and credit clause. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So every state must respect the laws that are passed by other states. They must give full faith and credit to the laws of other states. You're guaranteed the privileges that come with the Constitution. You're guaranteed a Republican form of government. No states shall be admitted to the Constitution without the granting of the ability to do so by Congress. So we had a discussion a while ago in California about having a constitutional amendment that would divide California up into multiple states. Well, California itself, the voters cannot decide to divide themselves up. That is something that only Congress can decide when and what new states to admit to the Union. So that's a congressional type of power. Again, as I said, you're also in Section 4, all citizens of the United States are guaranteed this Republican form of government, meaning that they are guaranteed the ability to vote for the representatives who will be making decisions for them. Article 5 then talks about the amendment process. Now, one of the fatal flaws in the Articles of Confederation was that in order to amend the Articles, you needed the agreement of all 13 states. Well, imagine how difficult it would be to get the unanimous agreement of all 13 states to amend the Articles. And the framers knew that. That's why when they created this new Constitution, they established new processes for amending this new Constitution. So essentially in Article 5, we have 4 different ways that we can amend the Constitution. The first way is proposal by 2/3 of members of the House and the Senate and ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. That's the first approach to amending the Constitution. That is the only approach we have used. We've only used that approach because the other approaches can get to be kind of scary, because some of the other approaches require constitutional conventions as opposed to ratification by state legislatures. We're a little concerned that if we go down the road of a new constitutional convention, it will be a runaway convention because we know what happened last time, and we may end up throwing out this Constitution and completely replacing it with a new one. So we've only used that first path to amendment. Proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. The second approach to amending the Constitution, again, proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So you would organize a convention in your state rather than having the state legislature ratify the Constitution, the constitutional amendment. Then your third approach, you can have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then whatever amendments come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Again, that's a scary one because you're having a national constitutional convention. Then the fourth approach, 2/3 of the states can petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then any amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified at individual state constitutional conventions. Again, scary because you're using conventions. So we never use 2, 3, and 4. We always use method number 1 because that avoids those constitutional conventions. But it gives us these ways in which we can amend the Constitution if we deem that necessary. So the framers realized that the Constitution may need to be amended down the road because of changing situations and circumstances, and gave us paths for amending that Constitution. Article 6, one of the most important things in Article 6, there is that second paragraph known as the Supremacy Clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. This is a very strong pronouncement of national government power. So when this Constitution comes into conflict with the state constitution, this Constitution wins. The national Constitution wins. Again, it's an interesting type of compromise that we see to try and deal with this conflict between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. This supremacy clause is the Federalist, this is an example of the Federalists winning. This is a very strong pronouncement of national government power. However, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that's a victory for the Anti-Federalists. And it kind of balances out this pronouncement of national government power with the retention of certain rights for state governments and for individuals. But the most important part of Article 6 is that supremacy clause. Then Article 7 talks about the ratification of the new Constitution. Again, it had to be ratified by 9 states before it would go into effect. As we said, the problem with that is that New York was not one of the first 9 states to ratify it. So what we had to do is we had to get New York on board. And the way in which the framers decided to get New York on board is to do 2 things. One thing is to immediately amend the Constitution right off the bat with 10 new amendments called the Bill of Rights to, again, alleviate some of the concerns among citizens in New York that this new Constitution, this new national government would be too powerful. And then the second thing we did is had Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay write the Federalist Papers. Madison wrote the majority of the Federalist Papers. Madison wrote his fair share of the Federalist Papers. John Jay only wrote 3 before he got sick and was unable to write any more. So the Federalist Papers really primarily come from Madison and Hamilton. But they were written, again, to try and convince the citizens of New York to support the new Constitution. So we immediately amend the Constitution with these first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. And you're all very familiar with these. The First Amendment, the right to exercise, establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof, made no laws may be made by Congress to prohibit those 2 things. The important thing here is there are 2 aspects to freedom of religion. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So there's an Establishment Clause, meaning that Congress may not make any laws telling you which religion you have to believe in. You are allowed to believe what you want to believe. Then there's the Free Exercise Clause. Now, this is the one that's been interpreted by the courts to allow certain limitations. So if the free exercise of your religion encroaches upon the rights of others or endangers public safety, governments may place limitations upon your ability to freely exercise your religion. So that can be limited. Establishment cannot be limited. No laws can be made to abridge freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition government for redress of grievances. Now, we know over the years, the courts have allowed certain limitations to this. And so in terms of, freedom of speech, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. You cannot use speech that will endanger public safety. Freedom of the press, we know that there are some limitations on what the press can publish. We don't have prior restraint in this country, meaning that we can't necessarily stop publication, but there can be penalties if you are releasing national secrets through a story. There can be penalties applied to that. Right of people to peaceably assemble. You can assemble, but you oftentimes have to get a permit to assemble. And if you're going to have some type of protest, you oftentimes have to get a permit to have that protest. And so we have allowed certain limitations in terms of those First Amendment rights. Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We argue about this one all the time in terms of gun control legislation. And yes, the amendment says that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but the first clause is also important as well. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's not in there by accident. And if you go on and read some other works by Hamilton and a couple of his additional Federalist Papers, Hamilton actually gets into a very specific discussion of the militia that's necessary, and the types of training and the frequency of the training that these militias would need to engage in order to be well regulated to make Amendment number 2 operative. And so it's interesting if you actually go on and read beyond the Constitution what Hamilton had to say about these well-regulated militias. The Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers. Again, that relates directly to your right to privacy as a citizen. You can't be forced to allow soldiers to reside in your home and to take shelter in your home. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Unwarrantable search and seizure. And so if they are going to search your house or search your belongings, it usually requires a warrant. So you have to go and you have to get a search warrant before you can do that. Fifth Amendment also deals with your criminal justice types of protections. Important things in here are things like your protection against double jeopardy. Double jeopardy is being tried for the same crime twice. Now, it's a pretty blanket protection in the Fifth Amendment against being tried for the same crime twice. The problem, though, is that protection against double jeopardy only applied to the national government. This protection did not initially apply to state governments. And there was, we're running short on time, but there was a case back in 1937, Palco versus Connecticut. And the state of Connecticut found this individual, Palco, guilty of murder. And they tried to find him guilty of murder, I should say. In the first case, he was acquitted. He was found not guilty. They didn't prove their case. So Palco thought he was done because he had already been tried. State of Connecticut comes back and tries him again, exact same case, exact same facts, find him guilty the second time, and sentence him to death. Palco takes his case all the way to the Supreme Court and says, wait a second, I'm protected against double jeopardy. Supreme Court said, we're sorry, but that protection only applies to the national government. The state of Connecticut is not covered by the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. It didn't help Palco very much after he was executed, but about 30 some years later in 1968, there's another Supreme Court case called Benton versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court finally said, yes, your Fifth Amendment protections also protect you against the actions committed by a state government. You cannot be compelled to testify against yourself, and you may not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. You must have your day in court before you can have life, liberty, or property taken away from you. Sixth Amendment is your right to a speedy trial. So you have a right to speedy and a public trial. You have a right to an impartial jury for that speedy and public trial. You have the right to have assistance of counsel. And so this flows then eventually into the case of Miranda versus Arizona that then created your Miranda rights. And now you get Mirandized whenever you get arrested. And again, that relates back to the Sixth Amendment. Seventh Amendment gives you a grant of a jury trial in civil cases of more than $20. And so if you're in a civil case and the value of the case is more than $20, you have the right to a jury trial. Again, $20 meant a lot different in the late 1700s than it did or certainly does today. Eighth Amendment, no excessive bail, no cruel and unusual punishment. And so when we talk about capital punishment, we always look at the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. Obviously, a lot of states do have capital punishment laws on their books, and most of those have been upheld. Gregg versus Georgia was a very important case from several years ago that tested the constitutionality of capital punishment. The Ninth Amendment of the Constitution says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Meaning that even though we are giving certain rights to government in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that we are denying other rights from people. So if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, those rights essentially belong to the people. And then the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is what's called the Reserve Powers Amendment. So any powers that are not explicitly given to the national government in the Constitution, all those powers then belong to state governments. Now, again, you compare this Reserve Powers Amendment, the 10th Amendment, to the Supremacy Clause that we talked about in the 6th article of the Constitution. Those two things don't really balance out very well. The Constitution saying the Constitution, the laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land. here in the Reserve Powers Amendments, we're saying, well, if you're not explicitly enumerating a power to Congress, then that power then belongs to the states. And so this is kind of the dichotomy that we deal with in terms of which level of government should have the power in our system of federalism. There are some parts of the Constitution that argue against other parts of the Constitution, but that's kind of natural because it is very much a series of compromises. So the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution, along with the influence of the Federalist Papers, got the state of New York and citizens in New York to ratify the Constitution, and the Constitution was then operative in the state of New York, and the country, for lack of a better term, was back in business. Very quickly, in the few minutes we have remaining, let's look at the remaining amendments, amendments 11 through 27, just very quickly on what they are and what they did. The 11th Amendment limited the judicial power of the federal judiciary. The 12th Amendment, again, changed how presidents and vice presidents are elected. So it's not, you got first, you're president, you got second, you're vice president. Now presidents and vice presidents essentially run together. The 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment then prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment then is the Equal Protection Amendment, guaranteeing for everyone, every citizen of the United States, equal protection under the law. This, to a degree, did what we called incorporated a lot of your Bill of Rights protections to include state governments. And so a lot of those protections then got included as protections against state government action with the 14th Amendment as well, the equal protection type of amendment. Then again, quickly, the 15th Amendment, you cannot be denied your right to vote based upon previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment creates the federal income tax, ratified in 1913. Our 17th Amendment then changes the way in which we elect senators. So senators are no longer selected by state legislatures, but as of the 17th Amendment in 1913, they are now directly elected by citizens. 18th Amendment was prohibition, prohibiting alcoholic beverages, the sale and transport of alcoholic beverages. 19th Amendment, Women's Suffrage Amendment. 20th Amendment, then changed the terms of president and vice president. Before the 20th Amendment, presidents and vice presidents were inaugurated and began their term in office in March. The 20th Amendment backs that up until January and does the same thing for members of Congress. So they then begin their terms in January as opposed to March, so you don't have so many months in between the election and when their terms in office will begin. 21st Amendment then repeals the 18th Amendment and repeals prohibition. 22nd Amendment establishes term limits for presidents, so presidents can only serve 2 terms in office, again, as a reaction to the 4 terms that FDR was elected to as president. 23rd Amendment then gives electoral votes to the District of Columbia. So the reason why we have 538 electoral votes is because District of Columbia has 3 of those. And so that's why we have 538 currently. 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes, taxes that were being charged to keep people from voting and disenfranchising voters. 25th Amendment talked about presidential vacancies and what happens when there's a vacancy in the office of the presidency and the process in which the vice president becomes president. Also talks about presidential disability and how the vice president can trigger a vacancy in the presidency if the vice president deems that the president is disabled, unable to carry out their duties as president. So what the vice president can do is the vice president can, with the majority of members of cabinet, then petition Congress to declare the president unfit to serve and then step in and operate as president. If a majority of cabinet do not agree to that, then the vice president can work with Congress to set up a committee to determine whether or not the president is capable of carrying out their duties as president. There's a lot of discussion about the 25th Amendment over the past couple of years and how it would be triggered and whether or not it would be constitutional. Let's see, 26th Amendment grants the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then your final amendment, the 27th Amendment, is a really interesting one because the 27th Amendment was originally proposed by James Madison. and was then ratified in 1992. So it was originally proposed in 1789, ratified in 1992. 27th Amendment says that no law varying the compensation for services of senators and representatives shall take effect until the election of representatives shall have intervened. So in other words, members of Congress cannot get a pay raise until they stand for re-election. So if you want to give yourself a pay raise, you got to get re-elected after that before that pay raise will go into effect. Madison first proposed this back in 1789. It never got enough state legislatures to ratify it for it to become an amendment to the Constitution. Again, you got to get 3/4 of states to ratify it. So it just kind of lay dormant for generations. Then there was a student, I believe it was in Texas, maybe an economics class, something like that. And for that student's paper, he wrote a paper about how the 27th Amendment is still viable because there was no sunset provision. Most of the proposed amendments today will have a sunset provision where they will say if this amendment is not ratified within 7 years, it becomes null and void. Well, that wasn't in there when Madison wrote this amendment. And so since there was no sunset provision, he argued it was still a viable amendment. His professor didn't agree. I think his professor gave him a C on the paper or something like that. Undeterred, he then started this national attempt to try and get 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify this amendment. He was successful, and once 3/4 of state legislatures ratified it, it then became an amendment, and the final amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So proposed in 1789 by James Madison and finally ratified in 1992. So you can see the last amendment was ratified in 1992. And so it's been 30 years since we have had an amendment to the Constitution. Now, there are certainly calls today for the Equal Rights Amendment to go through the process again so the Equal Rights Amendment can be added to the Constitution. I know the Biden administration just came out in support of that. So maybe in the future, in the next few years, we may see an Equal Rights Amendment added as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. But currently, we only have 27. So it is a living document. The framers have given us provisions by which we can change the Constitution as necessary. We just do it very, very rarely. And again, the reason why we do it so rarely is I think we are very concerned about having a national constitutional convention, and probably for very good reasons. So this Constitution is established as our contract between government and the people. And we as public administrators need to be aware of this Constitution and the rights of citizens that we are dealing with. As public administrators, we no longer have this thing called sovereign immunity. In years past, if you were a government employee, you were employed by a sovereign government, you had sovereign immunity, meaning that your actions that you take in your office, you could not be prosecuted for those actions. Sovereign immunity no longer exists. Now public administrators have what's called qualified good faith immunity. Qualified good faith immunity says that you are protected from prosecution if you're operating in the good faith of the functions of your office, which means that you need to know the constitutional rights of individuals you are dealing with and endeavor not to violate those rights. As long as you are not violating those constitutional rights, then you have that type of immunity as protection. However, if you are violating constitutional rights of people that you are dealing with, you no longer have sovereign immunity. So it's very important that we understand the rights of citizens as embodied in the Constitution and endeavor not to violate those rights. Now, for sake of time, we only look at the US Constitution, but we also have to be mindful of the California Constitution as well. We have a California Constitution that bestows certain rights and protections upon the citizens of California that we as public administrators also have to be mindful of. So I would recommend to you, when you do have time, take a look at the California Constitution. It's structured much differently than the US Constitution. It's much more specific than the US Constitution because a lot of the parts of the state constitution have come not from a constitutional convention, but rather from the ballot box. They come from the initiative process or from a referendum. And so you've got a lot of very specific things built into the California state constitution. So That's all basic background foundational information that we need in this class to get us going, so that when we move into next week, we can get into some more practical aspects of being a public administrator and working in a public agency. So now that we have all this foundational information under our belt, when we get together again next Tuesday, we can look at the unique aspects in terms of accountability for being a public official. What does it mean for being a public servant in terms of being held accountable for your actions? What does it mean in terms of the ethical standards and the codes of conduct that are expected and required of us as public administrators? And so I'll introduce you to the American Society for Public Administration Code of Conduct next week. We'll talk about why accountability is difficult to implement in the public sector and some strategies that we can use in order to hold public administrators accountable for their actions. But we have 5 minutes left, I guess, officially. So after we have covered all these foundational elements, I know I've talked a lot tonight. I talk a lot more tonight than I'm going to talk in future courses, or future class sessions. So next week, we're going to have much more interaction, but we just had to get through all this basic information for this week. Do you have any questions about any of the foundational information we covered in the first half of class, or this very quick coverage of the U.S. Constitution in the second half? Everything good? Hopefully sounds somewhat familiar to you. Okay, great. If you have not had a chance to look through the Constitution, please do read through it on your own. Also, those Federalist Papers 10, 39, and 51 I provided, take a look at those. 10 obviously is the one that's important for you in your Beach Board essay. So do make sure to make a good read of Federalist Paper number 10. Then talk to me in your essay about factionalism, and if we're more factionalized, if you will, today than we were in Madison's period of time, and what can be done to try and mitigate some of the negative effects of factions. Remember, those essays, your initial and your 2 responses, are then due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, February 7th. Okay, great. Again, we'll have a little bit more interaction next week, but next week we'll get into accountability and ethics. Any questions you have at all about the Beach Board essays or any of this material, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you again for our 3rd week next Tuesday. Take care, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Professor.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Good night.